Hi, I'm Cody, and this is Time for History. Anytime I teach a history class, I feel like I have a choice between two strategies of how I want to do it. The first strategy is what I call the narrative strategy. In this strategy, basically you tell the story. You weave whatever part of history you're trying to teach into a single story, and you tell that story. And the students take notes, and then they go home and they study, and they memorize the dates, the names, the places, the events, the battles, the political legislation, all of that. And then on the test, they regurgitate it back. And the hope is that that will give them some kind of foundation for building other knowledge on top of those basic events and things that they know. And also you hope that they can synthesize all that information and try to find some kind of coherent storyline and lesson out of it on their own. I like to use a second strategy. I call it the analytical strategy of teaching history. And in this, basically, we look at the story and we slow it down. We put the story into slow motion and we interrogate it. We ask who, what, when, where, why, and how questions. So we look at what we know and we ask, how do we know this story? What are the primary sources? Who told us this story? Who was actually there? Who left behind sources? And what sources did they leave behind? And what did they say in those sources? And how do we know that those sources were accurate? And then we look at the historians who wrote about it and we say, what historians have written about this topic? And what did they have to say? How did they interpret the facts in different ways? And then we ask, what other perspectives could there possibly be? What perspectives are being left out? Maybe we have a few accounts, but all of the accounts are from educated men who were wealthy. But there were a lot of people. There were people who were less educated who just didn't know how to write about it. There were poor people. There were women. There were non-white people. Maybe there were sexual minorities or religious minorities who were there. And we ask what would have been their perspective? How would they have seen the event unfold differently? What if there was someone who was young? How would they have interpreted the event differently than someone who was old? And we ask why the event happened. What were the causal factors? Was it all about individual decisions, or were there group dynamics? Did it have something to do with the culture of the people? What role did the environment and the geography and the weather play? What about the religion that they followed? Might that have had some kind of impact? Their moral teachings, their religious beliefs, their political ideology, did that play some kind of role? And we look at all these factors in order to try to figure out why the event happened. And we ask, what if they would have acted differently when something happened? Would that have led to a different outcome? And why did they choose to do what they did? What was going on in their head? Why did they choose to do this instead of that? Was it an emotional decision? Was it a logical decision? How might we have reacted? How might someone else of a different background have reacted? And we can ask all these different questions. And the hope is that by doing that, we can not only understand the event that we're studying, but maybe we can find some clues about human nature in general and about how humans react to events and how the world works. On top of all that, the hope is that we can train our own brain to work in certain ways, to see events through the lens of history, to not only gain knowledge, but to gain skills of thinking about how do other people think, how do other people react, getting into other people's heads, looking at all the different factors that could cause different outcomes, looking at debates and seeing things from different perspectives. Studying history gives us the ability to do all of that. And it's so much more than just memorizing dates, names, and places. So eventually we're going to get to that, and that's how I want to do it. But before we ever get to that, I want to get to something a little bit more basic. And that's the topic of historiography. And in like the next 10 videos or so, that's what we're going to talk about. Now, historiography is the history of what historians have written, or the history of how historians have interpreted the past. So you can pick any topic, and let's say something happened 1,000 years ago. And over the last 1,000 years, 200 different historians have written about it. And each of those different 200 historians gave a different interpretation. Historiography looks at all of their different interpretations and asks, why did they come up with these different interpretations? Why were they able to interpret the facts differently? what factors played a role in that, and tries to understand what synthesis we could get out of all of this. Now, a close cousin to historiography is the philosophy of history. Now, historiography is normally housed in the history department, while the philosophy of history is more in the philosophy department. And historians often overlook the philosophy of history, but I think it's still very important. Philosophy of history looks at questions like, why should we study history? How should we study history? And what is history? Now, to many, that may seem like a very basic question. History is the study of the past. But is it really? When we study history, are we really studying the past? Or maybe what we're actually doing is we're studying documents left over from the past. We can't go back in a time machine and cross the Delaware with George Washington, but we can look at documents left behind from people who did, right? So when we study history, you might make an argument we're not actually studying the past, we are studying documents from the past. And that comes with its own complications. People have bad memories. If I were to ask you what you ate for dinner last night, you might not remember. Now imagine you went to a really important event back in 1997, if you were alive back then, and I want a blow-by-blow account. I want you right now to tell me what happened on that day in 1997. You're not going to remember a lot of the details. And that's the same thing with historical sources. People have bad memories. On top of that, people are prone to exaggeration. People like to make themselves look better, and they like to make their enemies look worse. So when we're reading historical sources, we have to take that into account. Sometimes historical sources contradict each other. Sometimes perspectives are left out. We have only sources from older people. What would a younger person think? What would a woman have thought at this event? And we have to infer all these different things that happen, all these different perspectives. So much goes into trying to study history. It's not just the study of the past, that's part of it, but it's also studying the documents to try to infer from those documents. Also, history looks at causes and effects. The idea is everything that happens is an effect that comes from a cause. But is it that simple? Does one cause lead to one effect? Or is it more like 50 things all come together at the right time to lead to this one effect? 50 causes lead to one effect. And if that's the case, then what is the historian supposed to write about? Do we write about each of those 50 causes and how they all came together at the right time? Or do we pick the most important cause, or maybe the most useful cause for what we're trying to study? And if causes lead to effect, that also brings up the question of what about human agency? To what extent do humans have free will? If a cause leads to an effect, then when I do something, is that just the effect of a cause? Or do I have some kind of choice in the matter? It's like, is there a cause and then I have 10 different options I can choose from and I chose this one? How does that work? We study history to try to figure that out. Another question is, does history have some kind of direction that it's going in? You always hear people say that history repeats itself. Does that mean that history is just going around and around and around in a circle, kind of like the seasons? Or is history moving forward as technology and science and all of this sort of thing develop? We're moving forward to some type of progress. Or is history moving backward, away from progress? I've talked to older people who say, back in my day, back in the good old days, when things were better, and they have this idea that history moves backwards. Or maybe it's all relative. What is progress to one culture might be backwards to another culture. Maybe it's complicated. All of these types of things are the things that historiography and the philosophy of history look at. And that's what we plan to do in the next 10 to 15 videos. This video has been a really broad look at historiography and the philosophy of history. In the next few videos, I plan to look at specific thinkers who had very specific ideas and answers to these questions. I think it's going to be really interesting, so I hope you will like, subscribe, and join us. I'm Cody. This is Time for History. I'll see you in the next video.